The rock climb. The morning following the unsuccessful attempt to climb the rock wall, Nurbu arrived with the mail and news of the terrible disaster on Nanga Parvat, the worst disaster in the history of mountaineering. It occurred on the 9th of June 15 when an avalanche overwhelmed the camp, killing 7 Germans and 9 Sherpa porters. The news cast a gloom over our small camp, for many men had lost all friends. I had known the leader, Dr. Carl Wayne, and had felt confident that he would lead his party to success. From the first newspaper reports, it appeared that he had escaped, but these were false. He had died like Willy Merkel, the leader of 1934 expedition, amid the snows of that most terrible and death-dealing of Himalayan peaks. The weather was in poor shape but not bad enough to prevent flower hunting. The abundant rain and warmth of the past few days had the effect of bringing many plants into bloom. The wide stony river bed, a mile above the camp, was colored a brilliant magenta by willow herb Epilobium latifolium, which flourishes on a diet of river born grit. In much of the same situation grew two Alardias, Alardia glabra and Alardia tomentosa. Alardia tomentosa grows 6 or 8 inches high and resembles a miniature marguerite, delicate pink in color and with silvery foliage scarcely less beautiful than its flowers. And Alardia glabra is much smaller and its almost stalkless blooms grows close to the gritty ground. At the sight of such flowers, I used sometimes to experience a feeling almost of despair. How could I ever hope to grow them in England as they grew here? Would they not lose their delicacy and become coarse and lank in the damp British climate? But the Alardia represented only one species in the vast family of Compositae, now in bloom. In stony places and particularly along the tops of the banks was a white foam of Anopheles, and I remembered that after the Kamet expedition, when its members reunited at the dinner, Raymond Green, who had brought a number home, presented each of us with a little bouquet, a happy thought. All over the lower slopes of the valley, a little senecio had put in a appearance. It reminded me a trifle distastefully of its bigger brother, the ragwort, which is a pest of the British countryside. There is a field of it near my home, and my garden receives annually some millions of its seeds, a large proportion of which germinate. There was also an Artemisia rusborginia, a member of a family which must have one of the largest distribution in the world, except for the daisy and buttercup families, Inula, Inula and S. virginuria, a species of golden rod or Aaron rod of British gardens, while the Erigoran family was represented by a charming purple daisy, Erigoran multiradiatus. Montmorency had come to an end, but now that there were sheep and goats in the valley, it was easy to procure fresh meat. A mile from the base camp was an old shepherd had taken up his abode in a stone hut, which he had roofed cunningly with strips of birch barks, and from him I purchased a sheep for 5 rupees. He was a fine looking old chap, and his deep set eyes seemed at the corners with innumerable tiny wrinkles, had that far away look acquired by eyes used to searching far horizons. His clothes and footgate would not have fetched sixpence in the commercial road, but he had discovered something that untold millions cannot purchase, peace and happiness. Every day he used to bring me sheep milk in a little brass bowl, He asked for and expected nothing in return, but Wang Di told me that any empty tins I had to give him would be much appreciated. That and so I presented him with a biscuit tin. He was delighted. That biscuit tin might have been a golden casket filled with precious jewels. During the afternoon and evening of July 9th, the weather improved and the following morning was cloudless. On the spur of the moment, I decided to camp below the glacier pass, which, as already mentioned, lead over the range of peaks to the north of the valley, but 2 miles to the east of the route described in the last chapter. A mile or so up the valley, the flowers were at their best, and I shall never forget the scene where a clear running stream meandered down to join the muddy glacier torrent. Millions upon millions of the little knotweed Polygonum affine covered the ground so densely as to form an unbroken carpet of rosy bloom, while scarcely less prodigal were the white everlasting, rivaling with matchless purity the fleecy clouds already gathering about the peaks. The hillside was red with potentilla erigophylla and blue with cynoglossum and purple with geraniums, and on the flat stony floor of the main stream bed was acres of Pugh's willow herb. A little distance farther on we turned up flower-clad slopes which increased in steepness the higher we climbed. Here grew a large purple aster with widely separated petals, which I recognized at once from Holsworth's description as Aster diplosphedois, a noble flower not growing in colonies but scattered singly over the slopes. As a contrast to these more obvious beauties was a tiny blue forget-me-not like flower growing in sheltered gritty slopes where it could not be overturned by larger plants. But the most delightful plant of all, if comparisons are permissible, was Cremanthodium decanis, which I found in the shelter of a rock at about 14,000 feet, a comparatively low elevation for this height loving plant. Its little golden flower reminded me of the alpine Sordinella, and for it is about the same size and droops its head in the same way, a very coy and shy little gem of the high mountain. After climbing slopes so steep that were glad of our ice axe picking on the slippery turf, we gained on ridge sloping at a moderate angle. Some distance up this was perched a huge boulder forming a cave on the lower side which, to judge from the sheep droppings, was a favourite pull-on for shepherds and their flocks. The men welcomed it as it reminded them of a Tibetan camping ground, and wanted to pitch up my tent on a solid mass of sheep droppings, but genuinely surprised when I objected. Otherwise, it was a charming spot. Close at hand was a stream which cascaded down some rock slabs fringed with marigolds, while on the turfs all around was packed tight with innumerable little plants. Soon after we camped, rain fell heavily, but it ceased later, disclosing a lurid sunset. Himalayan sunsets are seldom so colourful as alpine sunsets, and in atmospheric beauty not to be compared with those of Britain, but this was an exceptional occasion, but no doubt to an excess of water vapour in the atmosphere, and a Gauri Parvat glowed like a forging just withdrawn from a blast furnace, and continued to glow long after the first stars had appeared. As I lay in my sleeping bag, I could watch through the door of the tent that upward creeping tide of a purple shadow, an iridescent opal at its edge, slowly engulfing the glowing precipices until only the final crest was left to the sun. This faded and the purple deep, deepened. Then, unexpectedly, as it must have been due to the reflection from some high and far distant clouds, the glow returned, not as brightly as before, but of sufficient strength to lift the great mountain, out of the night for few moments in an unearthly splendor. This was the last of the day and was quietly superseded by the usual pale afterglow that invests high snow peaks in a light infinitely cold so that they resembled icebergs floating on a dark sea. I woke in the night with a start to hear a dull roaring sound and above it a succession of sharper crashes. A fall of stones was descended in a neighboring gully, and looking out of the tent, I saw a long line of scintillating sparks as the boulder collided with one another on stuck against stationary boulders, as unusual sight which I have seen only once before. It was a fine morning when Pasang woke me at 4 o'clock, except that the dawn light was diffused by a high mist. From the camp, a grassy boulder strewn ridge took up easily upwards to a small snowfield sloping to the crest of the pass, which we reached within 2 hours only of leaving camp. The shepherds who crossed this pass to Mana face considerable risk, as the northern slopes of the pass consist of a steep and crevassed glacier which forms a tributary glacier of a much larger ice streams in the valley descending toward the village. The weather was threatening and the little early mist had deepened into an opaque pall beneath which the peaks and the ranges to the south stood stark and forbidding. More of the sake of exercise than anything else, we scrambled up a minor rocky eminence immediately to the east of the pass. I had hoped for a view of the Mana peak, but it and the nearer ranges were concealed by clouds. Our intention was to climb something if possible, and my attention was immediately arrested by a striking rock peak to the east of the pass, which forms an outpost some 19,000 feet high of Nilgiri Parbat. To climb it from the pass would mean a climb of great difficulty, but the formation of the mountain suggested that if the ridge between it and the Nilgiri Parvat could be reached, the summit should prove accessible. To do this, it was necessary to traverse steep glacier slopes for some distance, then climb directly upward. At the same time, we must keep an eye on the weather and it be prepared to retreat quickly in the event of storm. In the Alps mountains usually turn out to be less steep than they appear, but the reverse applies to the Himalayas, and we found ourselves on slopes far steeper than they had appeared from the pass. Fortunately, the snow was in good condition, but was not more than a few inches deep and rested on hard ice. A fall on the slope of this kind must be checked at once, as it is not possible to drive in the ice axe deeply enough to form a good belay for the rope, and I kept a watchful eye on Pasang. He, however, was going better than usual, probably because he was unladen, and he accomplished a passage without the semblance of a slip. Next came a scramble up some rocks to a snow slope, which brought us to an almost level snow field immediately beneath the ridge for which we were aiming. At the side of the ridge, our hopes of reaching it easily were immediately dashed, for a face some 1,000 feet high and defended it at base by a berggrund, marginal crevasse, separated us from it. To the left was a belt of overhanging slabs, but to the right of it, there was a chance of climbing an exceedingly steep slope to a point on the ridge about a quarter of a mile from the summit. It was no place for a large party, so leaving Pasang and Nurmu on the snowfield, Wangdi and I set out to attempt the summit. The berggrund was bridged with snow in many places and we crossed it without difficulty. From the snowfield, the slope had looked steep and it proved even steeper than it looked. Prior to the recent snowfall, it had been a sheet of ice, but 6 inches of snow now adhered firmly and had frozen so hard that steep cutting was necessary. We had not progressed far when the sun appeared. The weather was improving, but we did not altogether welcome this, as it meant that sooner or later the slope would soften on the ice. It behoved us to move quickly, and we did not pause until we had reached the first of the rock slabs. These were an awkward to negotiate, for they were smooth and without belays for the rope. With any other porter, I would not have attempted this, but Wang Di had already proved that he could climb safely and steadily on the really difficult ground. As we reached the ridge, a burst of song fell on our ears, and looking to the left, we saw 3 or 4 little brown birds perched on a boulder, all singing lustily and very sweetly. This desolate ridge, over 19,000 feet above the sea, was a strange place to find songbirds. What were they doing there? Could it be that, like us, they were impelled to this high and lonely place by the spirit of the hills? The ridge stretched almost horizontally to foot of a rock steep fully 100 feet high. There was no turning this either to the right or to the left as far as we could see, and the only chance of climbing it was to tackle it on face, where there was a crack which widened our higher into a chimney. The rock was excellent, a rough, clean granite that reminded me of Chamonix aiguilles. Having seen to it that Wang Di was securely placed and well belayed by the rope to the bollard of the rock, I essayed the crack. This was awkward and strenuous rather than technically difficult, but strenuous climbing it tantamounted to difficult climbing at high altitudes, where even an ordinary arm pull is exhausting. Indeed, for of Everest, it can be said that if the climber nearing the summit encounters a rock, be it only 8 feet high, where an arm pull is necessary, he will, failing an alternative route, not succeed in reaching the summit. From the crack, there was an awkward step onto the slab at its side, a balancing movement which I could only accomplish when I had completely recovered my wind. The chimney above had to be climbed by means of back and knee work, which involved such a strain that I had to halt and rest after every upward shove my feet and arms. It was an overhanging and roofed above, and I had to leave in favor of the right hand wall to do which I had to balance round a corner on small holes. I now found that above me was a slab about 15 feet high leading to an easier rocks. It needed only a strenuous pull on my arms to take me up this, but I had discovered already that strenuous arm pulls were to be avoided at all cost. The alternative was en route to the right. It was not so strenuous, but it was much more difficult. Yet, tired as I was by the struggle in the chimney, there was no alternative but to follow it. I had taken 2 steps and was in the middle of the third when there was a tug at my waist and a shout from Wang Di, announcing that I had run out of the whole of our 80-foot rope. I was, with, I was within an eyes of climbing the slab, but there was nothing for it but to retreat and bring up my companion to the foot of the chimney. I had no belay for the ropes and was struggling and was standing an inch wide holes, so I shouted down to Wang Di, illustrated by meaning by gesticulating with one hand while holding on with the other, that on no account must we use the rope as a handhold, and even more important that he must not slip, as I could not possibly hold him. But Wang Di was always the one to rise to the occasion, and within a minute or two I heard him panting hard at the base of the chimney. There were now 30 feet of spare ropes available, just enough to allow me to climb to the top of the step, where Wang Di, now well secured by the rope, presently joined me. It had been a hard piece of work, rock climbing, the hardest I had ever done at the height. A little higher the ridge looked so difficult that as we were in no mood for further strenuous climbing, if it could be avoided, we followed an easier line across the east face of the mountain until we were able to climb directly upward over steep and broken but not especially difficult rocks, to a point above the difficulties. The top of the peak was only a few yards away, and soon we were seated on a slab with the detached boulder, the actual summit resting upon it. It was 8:30 am, 5 hours since we had left the camp. Wang Di was delighted and full of grins. The first thing I had was to take off my boots and rub my feet, which had become wet, cold and numbed during the ascent of the snow slope. This did not satisfy my energetic companion, who, seizing some snow pores, proceeded to massage them vigorously. If mountaineers had nightmares, the nightmare of the lost boot or boots must surely take precedence over all other nightmares. On this occasion, Bang D decided that my boots were not in a safe place, suddenly lifted them over his head and deposited them in a niche behind him. He did it so quickly that one of our awful moment I thought he was going to drop them. There was little view owing to mist, but 1500 feet beneath us was we could see Nurbu and Pasan waiting patiently. As a reminder of our success, Vandy, who had already let our stentorium yells, priced some rocks away which raced down to slabby face and ice slopes, left the birchgrund and finally came to rest only a few yards from the pair, who jumped up and bolted to his huge delight. The weather was windless and the sun warm, but these very conditions made an immediate descent imperative. So after Wang Di's rubbing had restored the circulation to my feet and my water-clogged socks had become wrung out of the partially dried, I replaced my boots while Wang Di occupied himself in a building a commemorative crane, after which we commenced the descent. I must confess that I disliked intensely the prospect of descending the 100-foot step, although, as I knew from experience, descending difficult rocks in the Himalayas is far easier than ascending them. So, when we approached the step, I looked for an alternative. There was only one possibility, a diagonal route which the face to join our ascending track at about two-thirds of its height, and this I was unwisely deciding to take. In order to reach the snow slope, about 100 feet of rock slabs had to be descended. These were not only steep but singularly holdless. Wang Di went first, firmly held by me from the ridge. Having run out of the full length of the rope, he called on me to follow. I did so, devoutly hoping that he was well placed. He was not, and when, after a careful descent, I reached him, I found him perched on a tiny ledge, supporting himself with one hand while taking in the rope with the other. It was a miserable stance with no vestige of belay, and I implored him to climb very slowly and carefully. He did so, and when at length he reached the foot of the slab, I breathed a sigh of relief. But my relief was short lived, for the another moment he began to cut steps, and it was only too plain from the sound of his boots that he was cutting into ice, not snow as I had anticipated. He progressed with painful slowness and appeared to take such difficulty in planting his feet firmly that, standing as I was on small holes and powerless to check a slip, my anxiety was intensified every moment. Once again the rope ran out and Wang Di called on me to follow. I shouted to him to drive in his ice axe and place the rope round it, but this he seemed unable to do. The reason was made plain to me that I descended. The slab did not end at this appeared to end but continued covered by a sheet of ice about 1 inch thick, which in turn was covered by an inch or so of powdery snow. All Wang Di had been able to do was to cut nicks in the ice plating just large enough for the extreme toes of his boots. It was the most evil place I had ever climbed and was fraught with every potentiality of disaster. I realized now that what a mistake I had made to leave the ridge. However, there was nothing for it but to continue and hope that within a few yards we would come to a good snow. Driving in the pick of my axe as best I could, the trusting that the toes of my boots would not slip from the minute holes. I descended to Wangdi, who seemed to be standing on nothing in particular. Once again he descended, and once again I observed extreme caution, for I doubt whether he realized what a horrible, dangerous place it was that we were climbing. And yet he was skilled and caution personified. A noble or Loch master could not have descended more confidently. 40 feet more, and up came a reassuring shout. He was on the good snow. It was not so hard as formerly, but this was to our advantage, for we were able to face inwards to the slopes and kick steps, moving without pause, and both together we presently rejoined our upward track. And half an hour later came up to Pasang and Nurbu, who had throughout watched the proceedings with great interest, but without understanding the difficulties or dangers we had endured. The snow of the traverse was in good condition, and soon we were back on the pass, whence a series of glissades and downhill run took us in little over an hour back to the camp, where we had a long rest and a meal. After hour or two later we were dawdled along the Bhayandar valley. I was able to appreciate once more the joys of climbing in Garhwal. A little while ago we had been straining every muscle on the steep and difficult peak as I have ever climbed in the Himalayas, and now we were among the flowers, the perfect mountaineering contrast. It had been a great day climbing.